Went out. To our major story of the day. There are loans, not contract. We start with that. Vice President Yemi Osinbajo said he approved the joint venture financing contract of the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation (NNPC). The National Special Assistant to Senior Special Assistant to the President, to the Vice President, that is, on media and publicity, Mr. Laolu Akonde, said on his Twitter handle that Osinbajo approved the contracts to deal with backlog of unpaid cash calls inherited by the current administration. But here, the VP himself.
There were financing loans, that joint venture loans. And of course, you know what joint venture loans are. They loan the IOCs, Chevron, any that's AGIP. So they have, joint venture loans that have to be procured. So in some cases, NNPC and their joint venture partners have to secure loans, and they need authorization to secure those loans. While the president was away, I granted the authorization, which is what the law provides. The law actually provides for those authorizations. So I did grant all of those. In fact, there were 2 of them, but those are presidential approvals, but they are specifically for financing of the joint ventures, and they are loans, not contracts. Not contracts, loans. Thank you.
They are loans, not contracts. That's the word of the Vice President. Well, this is the clearing the air comes more than a week after the Minister of State for Petroleum, Ibe Kachiku's leaked letter to President Muhammadu Buhari accused the Group Managing Director of the NNPC, Dr. Mekanti Baru, of insubordination and of awarding contracts without due process. Well, the NNPC GMD denied the allegations, insisting that due process was followed and appropriate approval received from the President. The minister and the NNPC GMD met on Tuesday for the first time since their disagreement broke out, and agreed to continue working together. Did the Vice President sign the said contract? The minister alleged that there was procedural breach. I have a lawyer in our Abuja studio and an energy expert. I have a lawyer, Mr. Eze Onyekwere. He's also the lead director of the Center for Social Justice and also an energy expert, Dr. Muhazu Magaji. Many thanks, gentlemen, for coming on the program. Let's begin with the clearing of all these issues, which on one hand, it looks so much like a legal issue. But let me allow Mr. Onyekwere to kickstart the conversation tonight. If you look at it, the Vice President said, look, I signed the loans, not the contract, which brings to the table the issue of procedure. From your own standpoint or from your perspective, Mr. Onyekwere, is there any breach?
Well, I will not definitely categorize this as a breach per se, but there were still some procedural flaws. If you look at the powers of the board under the NNPC Act and vis-a-vis the powers and duties of the managing director. And then you come back to where they talked about agreements that are going to be contracts or agreements that are supposed to be under seal, where the authentication has to be done by the signature of the chairman of the board. Then you ask yourself, if the board chairman is not aware of this, if he didn't sign off, hasn't the law been breached? Yes, if you recall that a couple of days ago, these issues were raised, and the spokesman of an NNPC merely said, an approval is an approval. When we was asked pointedly to say, are you sure you're stating the facts? Because if you got it from the president at that time, it was virtually handed over to, the acting president then. Therefore, he couldn't do that. He said an approval is an approval. So the delay, 2-3 days after to come to clarify the facts is a little bit late, but we want to believe the vice president. But this sets the ground for a lot of takeaways. What has happened is a challenge to the Nigerian nation, and we need to take a lot of good things out of that challenge, opportunities for redress, and how we can move the nation forward from there. So that's my take. If I would have said the GMD should have gone to sign off with his minister and the board, and then before proceeding, because it's like a step in the process was jumped. So that's my take, initial take.
Dr. Mugaji, now you are an energy expert, and some of the issues that we see here, the Vice President did say he signed a loan, not a contract. From your own understanding of what has transpired between the GMD and the minister, and what the Vice President had said, because there were reports that the President, in one hand, signed some of these papers. On the other hand, we hear now that the vice president did come out to say he did sign it. But in all of this that is playing out, a lot of technicalities is involved. What can you take away from this?
Well, basically, the issue here is that there is the responsibility of the GMD as the Chief Operating Officer of the NNPC, and there is the responsibility of the minister. And in this case, we have two ministers, the substantive minister, who happens to be the president, and the Minister of State. And the chairmanship of the board has been delegated to the Minister of State by the substantive chairman of the board, who happens to be the senior minister. So if there is approval, we will look at the chain of the protocol. When NNPC engage the IOCs, in this case the international oil companies, to raise funds for joint venture development, it will normally be a JV funding. But as you are aware, Nigeria is facing constraint on funding the JV. So they came up with something called IJV, which is an investment joint venture, where you could actually source fund from a third party, and in this case, a loan, as explained by the Vice President, to invest in the joint venture with a view to paying back this loan in many different ways, either in cash or in profit share or in the oil itself. So in this particular case, you will see in the later that is released that there are different investments. The one that is in question particularly is the investment between Shell and NNPC and Chevron and NNPC in the development of some OMLs, that's oil money lease, that require money which federal government do not have. So when they categorize this investment and they require the money, they sought the opinion of the presidency that, look, we have this, and in this case, the substantive minister as well, in London. If you recall, on the 3rd of August, the NNPC released a press statement basically celebrating the successful consummation of this IJV by Chevron, Shell, NNPC, and some 4 Nigerian banks. And that is a loan, as explained by the Vice President, which need to be paid after the production has taken place. So, but what is the procedure required for the approval? Ordinarily, a senior minister will chair the board, and the senior minister can, by virtue of the law, delegate his responsibility to somebody else to chair the board. And in this case, he has done it to the Minister of State. But that do not preclude the senior minister from taking decision on behalf of the board. It's very clear in the legal instrument of NNPC. So if the president has been approached that, look, this investment is required, and by virtue of his substantive position as the board chairman, referred NNPC to the vice president, who then was acting president, to authorize them to consummate this partnership. And I remember very well in the minutes, in the press statement given by the vice president's office, they say it is an approval of basically a preparation after due diligence to proceed with the protocol of securing and procuring this loan. So now we need to look at, clearly there is legality in terms of the authority that is deployed to consummate this transaction. However, the question is, this transaction as a whole, we should be looking more deeper into the transaction as regards to its value and its strategic importance and implication to the country. And I think that is where we need to focus on. Protocol of approval, I think, has been followed. NNPC was involved. The minister has been involved. The acting president has been involved. And these are the authorities required to approve any transaction. And in fact, like the vice president said, this is an investment proposal that require the go-ahead of the principals of NNPC to continue as a contract. It's not like, you know what, we are basically taking money from the federal government and therefore we need all sorts of approval. Now, but beyond that, the actual deals, if you look at the deals themselves, that is the deal between Chevron and NNPC and Chevron and Shell and NNPC, which tend to bring these two IOCs into the belly of the Niger Delta community to operate these OMLs that have been literally, that they moved out of, which secure the peace in the Delta. And that's more of my worry now, that the strategy of producing these assets need to be looked at.
All right.
It's not just the money.
Let me quickly put this to Mr. Onyekwere. If you look at one of the prayers by Dr. Ibe Kachukwu in that leaked letter, he did say that we save NNPC and the oil industry from collapse arising from the above non-transparent practices and empower the board you inaugurated to do the needful. Quoting the Dr. Ibe Kachukwu. From the ongoing, Mr. Onyekwere, do you see any form of cover-up?
No, you see, let me try to respond a little bit to what my colleague here has said. The board chairman, if he says the substantive board chairman is a president, he may not be right. Because the board chairman, the president has delegated that power. Ideally, under Section 5 of the Constitution, all the powers of ministers, special assistants belong to as executive powers to the president. And knowing that Mr. President is a human being who is not ubiquitous, who is not everywhere as God, that's why the Constitution provided for ministers and assistants. And the President, in recognition of that, has asked Mr. Ibe Kachukwu specifically to superintend over the board. And superintending as chairman, Mr. Kachukwu on his own cannot take the place of the board. He needs to convene the board. And therefore, the board will take a decision as a board. And if there is a tie, that's where the chairman has a second casting vote. So trying to say that Mr. President approved, per se, does not obviate the need for the board to meet. Mr. President is not the board. If he were still around, he will still be a member of the board. And you cannot, on his own, unilaterally take a decision. So if there was no board meeting, what he's saying is wrong in law, with utmost respect. I'm talking law here. I'm not talking sentiments. So in essence, if the board has the power to manage the affairs of an NNPC, subject to the operational powers of the directors and the group managing director, and the fact that any loan or any contract or anything of that magnitude, you can imagine Mr. President is coming to the National Assembly to ask for a 5.5 billion loan to fund the operations of the budget 2017. And we are discussing a loan, money that's in excess of $3 billion. And you are saying somebody can unilaterally approve in his capacity as well. So we are saying that what we should be insisting on are takeaways. All
right. We'll talk about the takeaways. Mr. Onyekwere, for a moment, if you can just pause. We'll talk about the takeaways and some of the underlying issues, especially when the vice president has come forward to say, I did sign the papers, the loans that is, and not the contract. More on these issues when we return.